Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Welcome back to Cold Case Christianity. I am J. Warner Wallace. Well, we have been going through in Season 5 of Cold Case Christianity the quick shots. And I don't want to beat this with a stick, because if you've been joining us, and now it's probably the 14th or 15th episode of this, you already know what quick shots are. But if you don't, quick shots are just those quick responses, brief, pithy responses to the most common and most rhetorically powerful objections that are offered against Christianity. And what we're trying to do is to give you a way to assess the objection to begin with, right? And then to respond to the objection so that it won't become a conversation stopper. Again, you can go to our website at coldcasechristianity.com. You will see that there's a tab there for our phone app, and that is the absolute best way to find these quick shots, is on our phone app. Please download it. It's available for either the iPhone and the Android marketplace. If you simply go and type in Cold Case Christianity, you'll see a couple of different things you can get. One is a book. The book in audio form. What you're looking for is the free phone app, because that app is hopefully going to help you to make the case for what you believe. And by the way, we have spent time in that phone app to make it a real valuable tool for you. As a matter of fact, if you've got questions you want to ask me, the very best way to ask questions is to simply get in the chat rooms on the phone app, because you'll see there's lots of people using those chat rooms and they're responding to each other. I try to also jump in there and answer questions when you've got them based on any of the things we've talked about either on this show, in our articles online, in the videos online, the podcast, all of that stuff. Remember, we try to do our best at Cold Case Christianity to provide you with resources to help you become the best Christian case maker you can be. And that means that we want to do something pretty much every day. And so 5 days a week we provide you with content, either articles, videos, or podcasts, that'll help you make the case for what you believe. So please join us there at coldcasechristianity.com, and I hope you'll bookmark it and make it a part of your daily. Look, a lot of people get up in the morning and they have a few websites they go to daily just to kind of catch up on news, to catch up on all kinds of things. Well, 5 days a week we've got something new for you to read, watch, or listen to at coldcasechristianity.com. And in fact, all of these quick shots are downloadable as PDF files without any of the extra website material, just the article itself. It's also printable that way without any of the extra material. It prints like a Word document if you simply want to print the page. You can keep these things. You can assemble your own library. You're seeing there's some library behind me. There's some books I've collected over the years. I will tell you that in the first year or two that I was a Christian, as I was researching all of this data to be able to make the case in my own head first, it took me about 6 months to do that. Well, the internet was still in its infancy. And there wasn't a lot there wasn't near as much published apologetics material or published historical research as there was material online already. So I started printing those. And I didn't even have a computer at home with the internet, but I had one at work. So I asked my sergeant at the time, I said, if I come in an hour early every day and I give you a ream of paper for every ream of paper that I print. So in other words, I know I'm going to be using your printer ink, so can I just give you paper in exchange for the ink? Would you allow me to surf and print every morning before I start my shift? And my sergeant said, that's the weirdest request I've ever heard. But yeah, I'll let you do that. So I brought in several cases of paper, and I started printing every morning and assembling these things into notebooks. And before I ever had books of my own, I had notebooks of data. Either I printed the church fathers' work, or I printed this, or whatever I printed, I put it in notebooks and organized it, and I simply put it on my bookshelf. And then I would go back and forth, and I created my own library from either the ancient church fathers or whatever it may have been historically that I was looking at as data. Oh my gosh, it was kind of looked pretty lame, because the notebooks were just all black notebooks with labels on them sitting all over my bookshelves, and I had bookshelves all the way to the ceiling at the time. And I remember thinking, boy, this is But a lot's been written since then. And the websites are better. But if you wanted to print data that you could actually assemble your own, you could do that pretty much for free as long as you got ink and paper. We've given you those resources at Cold Case Christianity. All right, today I want to cover an objection that I hear a lot that I think is worth our time and attention, and here it is. It's this idea that even Jesus didn't think Jesus was God. I mean, you guys in Christianity, you all think that look, Jesus may have lived, he may have been an ancient sage, and he's certainly said a lot of smart things, said a lot of important things, said a lot of things that would develop moral character, but don't think for a second that he thought he was God. That's crazy. If he thought he was God, he'd be a lunatic. And he never said anything. You never find a place anywhere in Scripture where Jesus says, hey, by the way, guys, you know I'm God, right? You know that I am God, right? You don't see Jesus say that. And so I often hear this objection, and believe it or not, I even hear it within the church. I was surprised to find how many people who would respond on social media to articles I've written who deny the deity of Christ. They would call themselves Christ followers, but that version, and they're not just necessarily Jehovah's Witnesses or other people who knock Jesus down to a lower level. Some of these folks are attending non-denominational churches where they themselves personally, I'm not sure what's being taught from the pulpit, but they don't believe themselves personally that Jesus is God. They're not Trinitarians. They're not people who believe in the triune nature of God. So I do want to answer this question, not just for those people who are outside the church who might object to this, but for people who are inside the church who don't yet accept this truth. How do you respond to somebody who says, hey, even Jesus didn't think Jesus was God? He certainly never said anything about it. Okay, I want to give you 3 ways, very brief, to respond. We'll do them in each of the 3 sections of this show. So here's the first one. I'm going to put it online. Remember, I'll put it on your screen because I want you to see the shortest possible version, which is the printed version. But I also know, just from doing this for years, that you're going to have to contextualize it. So you're not going to be able to read this woodenly to people. You're going to have to read it to yourself and then translate it for people in the context of who you're talking to. So let's do that a little bit, and here it is on your screen. So how do you respond to this objection that Jesus didn't even think he was God? Well, look, I don't know if you realize this or not, but Jesus consistently spoke as though he was God. I mean, that's at least the very, very first step. I'd have to look at that. I mean, if you said, well, Jesus didn't actually say this literally, well, first of all, he might have said it in the context of the first century. You might have missed it. But one thing is for sure, Jesus consistently spoke as though he was God. All the other biblical wise men, the Old Testament prophets, all those folks who spoke and whose words are now recorded in the Old Testament, for example, they spoke for God. They always started their statements with some form of, this is what the Lord Almighty says, or this is what the sovereign Lord says, this is what God says, this is what God Almighty says. It was always some preface that began with, these are the words of God. So listen up, folks, these are the words of God. But you know that Jesus never did that? He never, ever, ever spoke that way. He never started a sentence saying, God says, the Lord Almighty says. No, instead, he said, verily, verily, I tell you. Or truly, truly, depending on the translation, I tell you the truth. I am about to tell you something. He never spoke for God like the Old Testament prophets. He always spoke as God. There's a difference. He assumed that he had the authority of God, and that's why he didn't say, hey, God says this. He said, I said this. I say this. I'm speaking with the authority of God. And by the way, that was not missed by his hearers. They often tried to corner him for blasphemy because they believed that they knew that he was speaking as though he thought he was God. Now look, why would he speak that way if he didn't think he was God? So this idea that Jesus didn't even think he was God, that doesn't jive with the facts, especially when you can see that he spoke as though he was God. So I really think part of it is that we want to be able to help people see that we talk about this in forensic statement analysis, that your words will give you away, and Jesus' words also gave him away. All right, take a break. We come back. I'm going to give you another short way to answer this objection.
Need a speaker for your next conference, retreat, training seminar, or church service? Jim travels around the country making the case for the existence of God, the deity of Jesus, and the reliability of the Bible. He'd love to partner with you to create a powerful, transformational training experience. Just visit the Cold Case Christianity website and click the Book Me tab. You'll find everything you need to know, including a list of Jim's speaking topics, promotional materials, Jim's speaking calendar, and a link to connect with our team so we can book your event.
Okay, now I want to give you another way that you can respond to this objection that Jesus didn't even think that Jesus was God. Okay, we talked in the last section about how even if there's not a direct statement, if all I had were the indirect statements of Jesus, this would provide me with strong circumstantial evidence, the nature of his statements, right? Would at least tell me that he, and that's why, and his hearers knew this, and to not speak for God, but to speak as though you have the authority of God. Oh, please. Either you're crazy, or you're just provocative, or you really think that you're God. Now you can say that's crazy, but the idea, the objection is that even Jesus didn't think he was God. Well, look, that's not true. Now you could argue that he falsely thought this, that he was crazy to think this, that he shouldn't have thought this, all those things. That's another issue altogether. But to argue that he didn't even think he was God, that's kind of silly, given the data we find in Scripture. Let me give you another way that you could respond to this, and then we'll elaborate on it, and I'll put it on the screen for you again. And remember, these are the shortest versions, the screen versions. We're going to have to contextualize these a little bit, and that's why I'm doing this with you on the screen, so you can compare the way that I'm contextualizing, given the basis I'm starting from, because that's what you're going to have to do as well. All right, so let's get after that. Here it is on the screen. Okay, if Jesus didn't think he was God, why in the world would he accept the worship of others? I mean, right, that the Jewish people were raised with the Ten Commandments. And the first of those 10 commandments is pretty simple. It's, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. And this is why the idea of accepting worship was troublesome and offensive to those who were God worshipers. They realized that God is God, I am not. As a matter of fact, you'll see in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, where key players are out healing people, and as a result of them healing people, some of these folks wanted to worship the apostles, the disciples of Jesus, as though they were Greek gods, right? You'll see this in the book of Acts. And what's the first thing that those disciples did? They said, get up, don't worship me. I'm not a god. I'm a human just like you. Because they knew that to accept worship violated the first commandment. It was to say that I think I am a God worthy of worship when there is no God but God. And for that reason, Jewish believers did not offer worship to anyone other than Yahweh. And to accept worship as if you were God, that was clearly blasphemous. But that's exactly what Jesus did, right? Over and over and over again, repeatedly, he accepted worship from his disciples, from those that he healed, like the leper, right, and the blind man in the Gospels, and even from synagogue rulers. Why would Jesus do something like that? Why would Jesus accept worship from people, which is a blasphemous act, if he didn't at least think he was God? Again, you can argue that he isn't God, that was foolish, that he was crazy to do that. But the idea here is that clearly Jesus thought he was God because he accepted the worship that was offered, and it was limited, prohibited only to God, to Yahweh. To do that, if you don't think you're God, I mean, this is why he was accused of blasphemy so many times in the New Testament. Because he acted as though he was God. He accepted the worship. He spoke as though he was God. Clearly, these are ways in which Jesus is demonstrating, at least in his own mind, that he thought he was God. Now, I get it. You could object to that. And you could say he's crazy. But listening to the behaviors, by the way, we do this in criminal trials all the time, right? We watch how a suspect behaves prior to the crime, because it's like a fuse that's burning. And it's burning toward that detonation moment which he's going to do something he shouldn't do. And then after that explosion takes place, there's all this stuff that's lying around from the explosion. what we're doing for criminal trials is helping juries to see the fuse burn, to see the act occur, and then to understand how all the pieces that fall to the ground afterward are only consistent because he did do this. And so we're looking at behaviors of the suspect both before the crime and after the crime. I'll give you an example of this. We did a case one time where we interviewed someone back in 1980 or 79. This ends up being the suspect in our case. And we interviewed him within a day or two of the murder. And we determined in advance that the interviewers determined that they were not going to tell him that the victim had been killed. They were simply going to say that she was missing. And that was going to help us because we said that she was missing. And he said, okay, well, he went along with it. Now, of course, in his mind, he knows that she's dead, right? But she's not missing, she's dead. But we simply went on with missing. And then at one point in the interview, he accidentally slipped and said something that confirmed for us that he knew she was dead. But we hadn't told him she was dead. We had just told him that she was missing. So how would he infer that this was a slip? His words gave him away. Well, this process of trying to set the stage, right? We do that intentionally so we can set the stage and see if he'll give us a piece of data that only makes sense if he is in fact the killer and has knowledge that he shouldn't have. There's something that happens to that too when you look at the words of Jesus, right? You're looking to see what is the foundational mindset from which he makes any proclamation, because that's going to tell us something about at least about what he thinks of himself. And so it's using this forensic statement analysis approach that helps us to make a case that Jesus did. In fact, in the first section of this video, we talked about how those words gave him away, but clearly even his actions gave him away. This also happens with suspects. Sometimes they'll behave in a certain way after the fact that they should not be behaving in unless they know something they shouldn't know. If they return, for example, back to a scene where we think they've dumped the gun, and a guy goes back to that scene again and again to make sure the gun's not resurfacing, like if he pitched it off the pier into the ocean, if he makes 3 trips back to the pier, that he typically would never go to the pier, and everyone tells us he's not even a fan of the pier, but he goes 3 times after the case to make sure his gun has not been found, that behavior is going to tell us something about what he thinks he knows. Jesus' behavior tells us something about what he thinks of himself. So we're using both behaviors and words to see if Jesus thinks he is God. And I think in both cases, it's clear that he does. Let's take a break. We'll come back and I'll give you one more way to respond to this objection.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
What tactics should we expect the critics of Christianity to use against us?
Well, I mean, every time you do a case and the prosecutor presents their one side of the case, it's not as though defense attorneys sit there and go, wow, that was really good, I don't have anything to say. No, instead, even though they lose these cases that I've worked on, they'll take time to present a case. And they have a certain series of tactics they'll use, approaches they'll use in order to overcome the evidence we've presented. So for example, when you're working on circumstantial cases that have a large number of small pieces of evidence that point to the same conclusion and they have cumulative power, what I see defense attorneys doing is pointing to those individual pieces and trying to disqualify each one. I can explain those 20 pieces in 20 alternative explanations. Or they want to kind of undercut the value of each one. In other words, they want us to focus on the microcosm of each piece rather than see how the whole thing points together cumulatively to the same conclusion. I don't want you to see the forest through the trees. And that's what I see happening here as well. But you have to keep in mind though, if I've got one unifying explanation for these 20 pieces of evidence, or the alternative is I've got to have 20 other explanations for all the same pieces of evidence, which is the most reasonable conclusion? The 20 alternative explanations rather, or the one unifying this guy happens to be guilty. So that's the kind of thing we do in trial. But we also see though at some point it's not unusual to see a defense attorney try to undercut the reliability of the key investigator, for example, or a key witness. If I get to the place where I can make that person look bad on a personal level, maybe even have that person on the stand seem a little bit snarky or a little bit irritable. It's about character, and if I lack a substantive evidential rebuttal, I do sometimes see defense attorneys becoming quite snarky about just kind of an ad hominem attack, where they're just kind of attacking our nature. And I think I see the same kind of thing. Both those tactics I also see when skeptics will try to look at our case, undercut the individual pieces, try to come to the character, kind of make us look foolish in an effort to denigrate the quality of the evidence we're presenting. Those are at least two tactics that I see often used in trial that I also see on blogs, on the internet, anywhere where I see conversation. And one last thing, Bobby, we got to be careful as Christians that we don't take the same approach. I expect the defense attorney to do what it is he's been hired to do. And I expect opponents of Christianity to behave in a certain way. They're not Christians. What I don't want to see, though, is when we as Christians adopt the same tactics. Then I think we really have to kind of check ourselves.
Yeah, well said.
Okay, now in this segment, I want to really focus on words that are not kind of like circumstantial. They're much more clear. They're much clearer. They're not just that Jesus has a mindset so that when he does speak, he's speaking. No, there are places where Jesus specifically said things that only make sense if Jesus thought he was God. They're very, very clear. They're the clear statements of Jesus that we can look at and point to. If you don't think he was, they're the things that Jesus said that clearly identified him as God. So I want to just talk about those. Now again, there is a list of these. If you go into the Jesus section of our writings tab online, you will see that there's an entire section on just the case for Jesus. And just type in words of Jesus in the search bar at our website. You'll see there are several articles that give you the entire robust list. Again, I think you do need to know the bottom of the iceberg in order to be effective when you're only describing the top of the iceberg. So I want you to have that depth of knowledge, even though I know that in a conversation, you're probably just going to have to be able to talk about the categories of Jesus' statements. You're probably not going to have time or the ability, unless you've memorized these addresses, to be able to say, well, yes, in John 10:26, he said that. Well, maybe you might memorize that, but most of us just want to be able to say, well, there are these broad categories of statements that Jesus makes, and those broad categories give him away. Those broad categories are very, very clear statements on his part. So let's go ahead and do that again. Here is the response on your screen. Okay. Look, I think Jesus certainly said enough. I mean, he specifically said enough to indicate that he thought he was God. I don't have to just look at his behaviors and his kind of the tangential things that he said. I could point to specific things that he said. For example, you realize that he claimed to have the same place of origin as God. By the way, that's in John 8, verses 23 and 24. So if you're claiming you have the same origin as God, that's very unique. That puts you in a unique category amongst all humans, right? Not only that, he said that he had the authority over angels, like God has authority over angels in Matthew 13:41. Who has that kind of authority? God has that kind of authority. If he's saying he has that kind of authority, he's claiming to be God. He even claimed equality with God in John 10. Oh, there's that verse I was talking about that maybe you haven't memorized, from 25 to 29 in John 10. Look, the people who heard these statements, at least those three categories I just gave you, they were clear. They understood what he meant. They understood what his statements meant. In fact, they accused Jesus of claiming to be God. They wanted to stone him to death on several occasions. Why? Because he claimed to be God. It was his claims of deity that provoked them to want to kill him for blasphemy. I've only given you three sections, three different kinds of direct statements that he makes, in which it's clear he is saying directly and clearly that he is God. Have you considered the fact that people who heard Jesus in his own day, they understood him clearly to be saying that he was God? You get that, right? I mean, if you get that, that unlocks the key to everything else. I think sometimes it's possible for us to misinterpret words or expressions or phrases, pardon me, in the Bible, because we are trying to interpret them under the lens of the 21st century. And in an earlier broadcast here, we talked about how that word slavery is oftentimes misinterpreted. And you kind of think of it in New World language. And when it's offered and used in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's got an ancient Near Eastern meaning. It's very different. I think what we ought to do, if we're really serious about what we think Jesus said, rather than us interpret it and say, well, that's not the way I would have said it. I mean, if I was Jesus and I wanted people to know that I was God, I would have just flat out come out and said, time out, everyone. Just so you know, Yahweh, that's me. God, that's me. Now, he didn't use those expressions. So you could say, well, then he never thought he was God. Or you could actually, instead of trying to reinterpret the words, because you may not have his words in the proper context of the first century, but the people who heard him, they knew what he was saying in the first century. So instead of pinning on the words of Jesus, you could simply pin on the reaction of those who heard Jesus. That would be a way to know how was that received in its context. How was that received in the first century? And if you did that, you would come away with the idea, the truth, which is that Jesus clearly was making statements related to his deity, because everyone who heard him knew he was doing that, and they interpreted it that way. And so rather than spend a lot of time just kind of wondering what Jesus meant, why don't you just look at the reaction he got from the people who already knew what he meant? And if you look at that alone, you'll be convinced that Jesus believed he was God and was making these claims verbally to his audiences, who, as a result, often thought he was speaking blasphemy, and they wanted to kill him for blasphemy. They wanted to kill him because they thought he was thinking he was God. And as I said before, the first commandment of the 10 Commandments is there is no other God other than Yahweh. It is blasphemy to say that you are God. And it's blasphemous for Jesus to make these kinds of claims if he wasn't God. So I think that helps you to at least overcome. Now, even if you overcome these objections the way I've described them for you, can you see how you've just begun the conversation? You've just begun it. Because to argue that Jesus thought he was God does not mean he really is God. He might just be a crazy old guy who in the first century, or young guy, who didn't know what he was talking about. You're going to have to be able to make a case for the deity of Christ. And I think that case is going to be centered firmly on the resurrection of Jesus. And by the way, I've written about that in Cold Case Christianity, why I think the resurrection of Jesus is the most important piece of evidence in the Christian worldview. And in chapter 2, you'll see how I make a case for the resurrection. So I'm hoping that resource will help you to go a little bit further. All right? That being said, I hope that this episode has helped you to at least overcome this objection that Jesus never even thought he was God. And we'll come back next week with another objection answered in another quick shot. And until then, I'll see you right back here at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.